Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Human Rights Speaker Series event to kick off our Pride celebration here in the city of West Hollywood. I'm John Heilman. I'm the Mayor Pro Tem of the city of West Hollywood, and on behalf of our mayor and our city council, we want to welcome you to all of our Pride activities in the city. We have a whole series of events, One City, One Pride. There's more information about those events outside, and I would encourage you to join us this weekend for Pride here in the city of West Hollywood. Of course, we have the festival, we have the Dyke March Friday night, we have the parade, we have a transgender stage on Friday night as well. We welcome you to all of the events, and Friday night the festival is free, so hope you can join us. We also have another one of these speaker series events next week on the 14th. We will be joined by Bob Alota from the Estrella Lesbian Justice Foundation, as well as a number of activists from China who are here at the Gay and Lesbian Center who are being trained on LGBT activism. Currently, they're on the AIDS ride, AIDS Life Cycle, with members of the center, and they are going to join us next week. I hope you'll come back for that event as well. We have been doing events in the city of West Hollywood focusing on international issues. Of course, we're so lucky to be here in the city of West Hollywood, where we don't have all the rights we always want to have, but we're pretty lucky to be here in the city of West Hollywood. And certainly in the United States, we've made tremendous progress. But our brothers and sisters around the world haven't always had that same progress, and they've faced incredible resistance, hatred, violence, and death. And this is an opportunity for us to reflect on the progress we've made and also talk about what we might be able to do to help those around the globe. We are joined by four outstanding panelists, and I'm going to introduce them briefly to you. I believe that you have their bios, but for those who are at home, I'm going to give you a short introduction to our panelists, and they're going to tell us a little bit more about what they do. Jessica Stern is the Executive Director of Outright Action International. It was formerly known as the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission. Jessica has been a speaker for us in the past. She started out as an LGBT rights researcher at Human Rights Watch, and then she was a Ralph Bunche Fellow at Amnesty International. She has dedicated her life to advancing human rights, particularly the rights of the LGBT community. She was educated at the London School of Economics, and she also teaches at Columbia University. Jessica, thank you for joining us tonight. To her immediate left, at least from my side, is Steve Roth, who is the co-founder and director of Alturi, a new organization focused on bringing attention and support to global LGBT activists. Steve is an international communicator and entrepreneur and an advocate for LGBT issues. He founded Outthink Partners, a leading communications, marketing, and advocacy organization specializing in the LGBT market. He has lived in Europe, Asia, Latin America, and he speaks frequently around the world in efforts to engage the LGBT community. And to his left is Czeslaw Walek. He is the chairman of Prague Pride. He chaired Prague Pride Association since 2011. He is currently a Fulbright Scholar placed in Out and Equal Workplace Advocates in San Francisco. He was the Deputy Minister for Human Rights in the Czech Republic, responsible for creating, adopting, and implementing domestic policies on human rights protection, particularly human rights with respect to the LGBT community. He was awarded the Alice C. Masaryk Human Rights Award for his dedication to human rights in the Czech Republic. And finally, from the United States State Department is Wesley Reisser. Dr. Reisser has also been a guest of ours in the past. He has spent the last 13 years working mostly on Middle Eastern issues. Not that there are any issues there at all. He has served as the Consular Desk Officer for Israel, Egypt, Yemen, and United Arab Emirates. He has also been a desk officer in the Office of Israeli and Palestinian Affairs, and he's currently the Senior Foreign Affairs Office in international organizations. Part of his work there has involved a range of responsibilities. Part of what Wesley has done is create a policy on promoting human rights for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex individuals. And he also has won an award. He won the 2015 United Nations Association Human Rights and Diplomacy Award. So please join me in welcoming these distinguished panelists to West Hollywood tonight. And I'm going to ask each of the panelists to start off with a few minutes talking a little bit about their work, and I'm going to ask each of you to tell us what you think your major priority right now is, or what you feel the major challenge is for those who are working on LGBT issues globally. You're next to me, Jessica, so we'll start with you.
I don't know if that's favoritism or abuse. Hi, everyone, and I want to thank you for coming out tonight. I know that a lot of people think of June as a month of celebration, and they look forward to parties and bars and dancing, and all of those things are amazing, but I think it's incredibly valuable to have spaces like this one created by the West Hollywood City Council where we actually stop and talk about what is the state of affairs. You know, are things getting better, or should we all be crying into our pillow every night as we think about the work still to be done? It seems like the easiest question in the world, right? What are the biggest issues LGBTI communities are facing around the world today? But I think at any given moment there are very different ways to answer it. And I would always say that the situation that LGBTI people face is inextricably linked with the broader trends that are affecting all people. So when you open the paper, what do you read about? You read about climate change and environmental destruction. You read about growing economic instability and, potentially a global economic downturn. You read about a rise of fundamentalisms, militia violence, and you ask yourself, in this context, where do LGBTI people sit? And I would say that for me, there's two really important pieces to that analysis. One is the importance of understanding that when people are scared because they're facing all of these forms of transition and instability in their lives, very often they look for someone to blame. And the truth is, LGBTI people are often the scapegoats. Let's not think about how to tackle long-term systemic inequalities. Let's just blame someone so we don't actually have to think about how we have to be a part of the solution. And I think that many of us remember when we first saw the anti-homosexuality bill introduced in Uganda. Many of us remember when the so-called anti-gay propaganda laws were introduced in Russia. And these were classic techniques of scapegoating. I think in the context of a rise of militarism and non-state actor violence, as we see in the context of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, crises affecting countries like Iraq and Syria and all of us, really, the question that I ask it outright is, how do you actually put forth an argument to look at the specific experiences of LGBTI people within the context of a greater crisis? And that's actually pretty hard for some people to understand. I remember that when Outright started a project on LGBTI people in Iraq, just as ISIS was on the rise, I met with a very savvy, very motivated person who was extremely active in the Democratic Party, and he said, but why should I care about LGBTI people in this context? And of course, it didn't even take 6 months before we saw ISIS beginning to actually push men accused of so-called crimes of Lot over rooftops and to their deaths, many stories below. So, I think there are a lot of issues facing our community right now, and they're sophisticated. It's more than just a struggle for partnership recognition and marriage. It's how do we actually queer the discourse in a way that helps us galvanize allies at a time when a lot of people feel unstable. And I guess I would just say, at Outright, for us, there's a pretty important way of responding to that, and that is making sure that there are LGBTI organizations, in all of the many forms that we take, in every community that needs us, in every community where homophobia and transphobia is still a reality, so that we ourselves are articulating the solutions in the context of crisis, and we ourselves are building relationships with people that can stand up and be there for us, whether it's government or families or religious leaders. I was in Iraq maybe a month ago, and one of the amazing things I saw is that after going to Iraq many times over the past 4 years, we actually now have other civil society organizations like women's rights groups saying we need to talk about the vulnerabilities that gay Iraqis face. So I think in answer to your question, John, there's not one problem, but there's many, and with the problems come opportunities for allies.
That's great, and we're going to come back to you because I want to hear about the work that Outright is doing in Indonesia and some of the other places you're working. Steve, you're a part of a new organization. Tell us a little bit about Alturi and what its role is in advancing LGBT equality globally.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, John. And thank you, by the way, for organizing. This is such an important conversation to have, and thank you to all of you. It's a big night, obviously, with the primary and Pride Week, and a lot of places you could be. So we appreciate that you are here to be part of this conversation. So just to pick up a little bit on some of the issues that Jessica raised and some of the challenges that LGBTI people face globally, I mean, it's still, same-sex conduct is still criminalized in almost 80 countries around the world, which is 40% of the world's countries that are home to a couple billion people, punishable by death in around 10 countries, and many, many dozens of countries more where there are no rights or protections for LGBT people. So it's, we're starting with, in a lot of cases, a pretty grim landscape, and something that we have experience with in this country, but it's been many years and many generations, I think, since we faced that kind of open discrimination, hostility, and criminalization here in this country. On the positive side, one of the good news is, as John pointed out, we're a relatively new organization. We just launched publicly last summer. We've been in development for a couple of years, but one of the great things we learned as we started getting into this work is that there are amazing organizations around the world, and even the most difficult contexts and communities, that are doing great work, and that frankly know the situation best on the ground, and they know what needs to be done and how to get it done. But almost always the organizations are under-resourced. They can't rely on their governments for any funding. They're often at odds with the government. Likewise, they can't turn to their local communities. Sometimes there isn't a tradition of giving in the communities that they come from. So what they really need more than anything is resources to be able to do the work and to advance movements in their local context. And so we created Alturi to do that, to complement the work that's being done by other organizations in the space already, like Outright, but to start creating a movement in the U.S. for global LGBT equality, and to continue to keep Americans engaged in LGBT issues, but to start thinking more globally, raise awareness to the issues and what's happening, and then provide a conduit to support those organizations that are on the ground, that are doing great work. And so we do that. We do a lot of storytelling. We interview activists around the world. We have dozens of interviews with activists from Kyrgyzstan to Uganda to Jamaica that we've spoken with, and we highlight their work. And then we create campaigns to raise funds for those organizations. We have a campaign going on right now that I'll talk about a little later, actually focused on Indonesia and some of the challenges and the backlash against the LGBT community that's been happening there. So again, we're really a combination of content, partner organizations, and then campaigns to get attention and resources to those people that need it the most.
Great. Czeslaw, you've been on the ground in the Czech Republic. It wasn't easy getting Pride established there, and you've had your challenges. What are your big challenges right now? And tell us a little bit about the history of getting Pride established in Prague.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a great privilege and honor to be here. Coming back to the questions about challenging, about the state of the community and challenges that we are facing, I believe that LGBT community is really influenced by what's happening in our countries. In very rare occasions, LGBT topics are on top of agenda of any governments. We see it from time to time, but in general, governments are treating LGBT issues as either as a part of the human rights issues. If we are lucky, if we are not lucky, they don't treat LGBT issues at all. And in this, if we follow this logic, then the challenges that we are facing right now, for example, in Europe, is definitely a refugee crisis. And this refugee crisis has a huge influence on the politics in Europe. We see more and more populists and actually racists coming to the power, which actually will then influence LGBT community, because we can see that there is more and more hostile behavior towards LGBT, even in Europe. Just yesterday, I saw a post on Facebook from a friend of mine from Prague saying a story how he was verbally attacked and abused by a group of teenagers in Prague, which is very liberal, tolerant city, and it didn't happen so often before. Well, the other challenge that we will all face, and especially you, is if your country will elect Donald Trump as a president, because then, you are laughing, but a year ago, nobody would really think that he would be a Republican nominee, and today he is, and or not yet, but he's probably be. And if he would be elected a president, then LGBT community around the globe would suffer tremendously, because I presume that activities that your government is doing towards LGBT community around the world would stop. In our country, in the Czech Republic, we are considered as or the Czech society is considered as one of the more respectful towards LGBT when it comes to post-communist world or Eastern Europe. We have a quite high percentage of support for marriage equality. Since 2006, we have a law on registered partnership. There is not physical abuse of LGBT people. So, but we didn't have a Pride till 2010. We were one of the last capitals the European capitals that didn't have a Pride. So we said, well, it's bloody time to actually organize it. And when we started to organize it, first we actually faced quite a negative attitudes from the LGBT community. Gays and lesbians were afraid that if we go on the streets, we will meet with a negative attitudes, and our rights will actually diminish. And then once we overcome that, we actually met with quite negative attitudes from the general public. Even at that time, a president called us bunch of deviants that shouldn't have a right to walk on the streets. Well, this bunch of deviants walked on the streets, and we were joined by 8,000 people first year, which immediately put us among the biggest prides in Eastern Europe. And last year was the 5th year we had 35,000 people walking on a parade. But our festival is not only... Steve knows it. He was there. He was one of those 35,000. Our festival is not only a parade or parties, because we are in the middle. So we treat it as a public awareness campaign, and we had 122 events, from serious debates through cultural events, talks with business, and we also had entertainment parties. And I think that the fact that we choose this kind of form of festival, where for a week we actually intensively communicate with the general public, helps us to attract general public, attract attention, but also advance our rights. I think at this moment I could say that we are kind of a beacon of hope for Eastern European LGBT community. 2 years ago we had Zorian Kish from Ukraine visiting us, and he came after the parade to me with tears in his eyes, saying that, well, if you can do it in Prague, we can do it in Kiev too. And I think this is thing that we have to go on like this.
That's great. Thank you. And Wes, you have been working in the State Department in some very challenging areas, but you've also been very active in terms of advancing LGBT rights within the State Department. Tell us what you think the biggest challenge, and I'm not going to ask you about elections because you can't say anything about elections, but what do you think the biggest challenge is for the struggle for LGBT equality?
Thanks very much, John, and I want to extend a special thanks. It's wonderful to be back in West Hollywood as a former resident of this city. It's always a pleasure to be here, especially during Pride Month. And for the last 8 years, I've really been in a unique position that was very different than when I joined the diplomatic service in 2003. At that time, I joined the LGBT affinity group at the State Department, and our biggest accomplishment was to be able to have some sort of pride event inside the State Department building and to try and get some sort of recognition for same-sex partners of employees. And that was all that we were managing to accomplish back at that time, not all that long ago. And over the last 8 years, it started with just 5 of us, and now we have an LGBT task force with over 50 people who are meeting every month from across all the different parts of the State Department, working to address the whole range of issues that apply in the LGBT space internationally. Everything from advice for LGBT Americans who are traveling overseas about the situation in country to country, specifically documenting the human rights situation for LGBT persons in every single country in the world through our human rights reports, to the work which I've been most intimately involved in, which has been to really raise the profile of LGBTI issues at the United Nations and to try and institutionalize how the United Nations addresses LGBTI rights around the world. And so on the positive side, I would say that there's been some tremendous success. We've reflected a lot on some of the countries where there have been tremendous backlash and problems, but I want to highlight that over the last several years, it's not only the United States where marriage equality is now the law of the land and attitudes are changing widely among the population, but Latin America is another great example where we see many countries that are moving at an incredibly rapid pace to address LGBTI issues and to provide legal protections as well as a more just welcoming society for LGBTI people. And of course, we're seeing the same in many parts of Europe and starting to see that even in certain parts of East and Southeast Asia as well, whereas we see sliding back in other places. The biggest challenge I think that is on my mind right now is how to institutionalize what we have done to make sure that for the United States, LGBTI rights are not a boutique issue that can be tossed aside depending on the politics, but are just as intrinsic to our general approach to human rights as women's rights, as the rights of religious minorities, as rights for racial and ethnic minorities. And I'm not sure that we're quite there yet. And what we're trying to do, those of us who are just the career bureaucrats, not the political appointees, but who will be there come January 21st, regardless of the outcome, is to create a situation where this is just a normal part of our work on human rights and not some special thing, just another important issue that we continue to work on with others. I think the appointment of Randy Berry as the first special envoy for LGBTI rights was an important step in that regard, but there is no legislation that locks that job into place yet. So that job really exists at the pleasure of the Secretary of State still at this time. But a lot of the things that we are doing, once you put something in a US government report, it's virtually impossible to ever take it away again. And so I'm hopeful that a lot of the steps that we've been able to take will deal with that. I mean, internationally, I could point to 50 different issues that are the biggest problems, but I would just, at the most simple sort of 30,000-foot level, I would say that the pendulum effect is at play. That many places, the arc of history is swinging forward, things are improving, but in the places that are most opposed to those countries, not even necessarily to this particular issue, are choosing to entrench on this. Russia isn't only going after LGBTI individuals because it's convenient to point fingers at a small group to blame people for problems. They're also pointing the finger at LGBTI people because they associate that particular civil rights movement with the United States and with the West. And so it's a convenient internal scapegoat for the West. And I think that we're seeing a similar thing play out in Egypt right now, which is another country where we're seeing tremendous backsliding in the human rights situation, and especially for LGBT folks. In some African countries, we're seeing that same thing play out. And that, my hope is that the arc of history will eventually bend in the correct direction for all of those places. But as it is getting better in many parts of the world, there are certainly not just places that remain bad, but there are places that are getting significantly worse. And that is the hardest thing for me to wrap my mind around, exactly what are the things that we can do from the United States to help address those situations and be able to provide some degree of support.
You brought up the work that Secretary Clinton did when she was Secretary of State, really institutionalizing LGBT rights as part of the State Department's mission. Secretary Kerry continued that work on. I want to just ask the panel, what do you think the effect has been of those efforts? Did you see the results of that at all when you were dealing with issues in Czech Republic? Was there a significant shift? And do you think this policy really works on a global level?
So I can say from our perspective, but also from a perspective of other Pride organizers, U.S. embassies are a great allies to LGBT groups around the world. With our particular example, when the Czech president said those words in 2011, the U.S. ambassador Norman Eisen was the first one who actually supported the organization of the Pride in Prague. He sent us a letter of support. President at that time actually publicly on television said that this is a disgrace, that this is that he shouldn't do it because it's an internal matter, and the ambassador was working with us at the parade regardless. Since then, every year they are supporting us, and I know that they do. The embassies are doing it around the world, and I can tell you that it's a great help psychologically, but also in other terms, to know that there are people, there are embassies, there are offices that are actually supporting our cause.
And if I could jump in there as well, John, just just really picking up on everything that Czeslaw said, there's so many different fronts that I think the State Department is advancing LGBTI equality. Something else that the Obama administration has done that is a first in these numbers is President Obama has appointed, at least we have 6 current openly gay ambassadors. And that makes a tremendous difference. Not only do we have all of our other ambassadors and foreign service staff, carrying the message of human rights and equality for LGBTI people, but these ambassadors in particular. And I had the opportunity last year to work on a project with our ambassador to the Dominican Republic, Wally Brewster, who is the first and only openly gay U.S. ambassador in Latin America. And he's the one, you've probably heard about this archbishop who's called him a maricon and said that he should, if he's married to a man, he should be at home doing housework. And, he's faced some local criticism, interestingly, not by and large from the public, but from the most senior Catholic bishop there. But he hasn't backed down, and he's continued to support initiatives important to the LGBT community. We worked on one with him. It was a social enterprise helping to bring LGBT tourism to the Dominican Republic, to bring jobs and revenue, but also to help break down barriers. And he's been really unflinching in his support, and I think we've seen that in a lot of other parts of the world where our openly gay ambassadors have stood up and really represented the community. And beyond that, there's so much more the State Department's doing that Wesley can probably speak best to. But there's the Global Equality Fund, which is a multi-million-dollar fund that supports LGBT organizations and individuals around the world that are working to advance equality. So I think it really can't be overstated what the department's doing.
So Jessica, you work with a lot of organizations around the globe, and there's always this delicate balance. On one hand, we want to advance the values that we think advance human rights, but there's always this criticism of the United States that this is imperialistic and that we're imposing Western values on other people. How do you think this LGBT initiative from the State Department, how has it been received, and do you think there is a risk of there being significant pushback?
Thanks, John. For those of us that come out of the U.S. LGBT movement or who have worked on human rights in the United States, we have a healthy critique of our own government. It's our job to have a healthy critique of our own government. If you care about human rights, you always want to be striving for more. And so it's very important to analyze the Obama administration's policies and legacy with open eyes, evidence, and accuracy. And so I say with all of the trepidation of someone who comes from pushing the US government to do more over many, many, many years, that when Wes described some of the policy advances, and John, you emphasized the steps that have been taken forward, that they're real and true. It's not just spin that we're saying that sounds nice. And this all started with a presidential memorandum from Barack Obama, and then was carried forth in, not just policy frameworks, but also implementation and resourcing. But that said, it's hard to get it right. It's really hard to get it right. And U.S. political leadership is complicated in all places. So I guess I want to give an example that I think is really important and is something very daily to put things in context. So how many of you remember Hurricane Sandy? Raise your hand if you remember Hurricane Sandy. Okay, great. So Hurricane Sandy was a storm that, devastated the East Coast. And I remember sitting in my apartment in Brooklyn during Hurricane Sandy. And you guys know about New York City food delivery, right? It is the way people in New York survive. We have small kitchens. It's not just that we're lazy. And I looked out the window of my apartment during Hurricane Sandy, and New Yorkers are crazy. And supposedly, all vehicles were barred from being on the roads, except for emergency vehicles. Except like there's the guy on his moped delivering Chinese food in the middle of the storm. So, the context in New York was highly unusual. And so even New Yorkers who absolutely love delivery went somewhere unusual. We went to the grocery store. And I remember that, we're all going through this food craze where we all suddenly think we're going to be healthy and, undo all the bad things we've done to our bodies. So everyone eats kale, right? Raise your hand. I'm sure you ate 10 servings of kale. You're lying. You did not eat that much kale today. Anyway, we're all trying to eat a lot of kale. And so everyone in Brooklyn, where I live, bought all the kale. And literally, I don't know if you...
I know you're going to tie this back to LGBT rights, right?
No, I'm just actually talking about kale. It became a news story, right? I mean, maybe you guys even remember this. Brooklyn sells out of kale. And so people in LA were reading about it. And then I start seeing it on Facebook, and all these people are making fun of us, right? And I see my friends in Uganda, my friends in Indonesia, my friends in Thailand, they're like, ha ha ha, you guys love your kale, get it together. But it was this moment of complete insanity and clarity, because this mundane thing happening in the grocery stores of Brooklyn was literally reverberating around the world. Everybody knew what was not on the shelves in Brooklyn. And so if you actually take something important like your question, John, LGBTI foreign policy as a component of US engagement bilaterally and multilaterally, you can imagine how high the stakes are. And I want to give you a very concrete example. So Outright is the only US-based LGBTI organization to be officially recognized by the UN. And that's a double-edged sword, right? Because we want to watch what the governments say and do in our name. But in that role, we try to do a lot to advocate for LGBTI rights globally, and we're a part of this thing that we co-founded called the Core Group. And the Core Group is a collection of 18 governments from around the world, 1 UN agency and 2 NGOs that commit to using the United Nations to change the definitions of international law and to establish a normative framework that says unequivocally, every time, human rights are universal and human rights are LGBTI rights. And so in that context, one of the things that we've kept pushing the Core Group to do is to be more ambitious. And so one thing that we said was, there's this week when the UN General Assembly opens every September, and it's when all of the presidents and the foreign ministers around the world travel into New York and travel to the UN, and they only talk about the most important crises and opportunities of the day. And it's such a literal embodiment of the world's political agenda that the week is called the High-Level Meeting Week. And so what do you do if you're a good queer activist? You say, if you want to talk about the priorities of the day, you need to talk about us. We have to be a part of the most important priorities. And so we started sending this message to different governments that we work with. And I'm going to be totally honest with you. They were not excited. They were like, we have real problems to deal with. You are not one of them. You're just annoying. And this was an example where US leadership really changed the discourse. And what happened was we worked with the US mission to the UN, and we were able to secure Secretary of State Kerry to actually agree to keynote an event that we did during High-Level Meeting Week. And I wish I could tell you that the event would have happened even if Secretary Kerry hadn't been there. I wish I could tell you that all of the governments would have just seen that this was right and this was just. But the truth is, because he was there, the event happened. And so I think the challenge in response to John's question is, first of all, what is wrong with the world that we are so dependent on one government to show leadership on this issue to move the agenda forward? But on the flip side, what is the opportunity that we have when we find governments that are willing to actually put leadership behind the issues that matter to us? And so I think we can talk a lot about the ways that LGBTI rights are discredited as a Western colonial imposition, but the people in this room, we know that discrediting LGBTI communities is not a new concept. This is just an old way of discrediting us, and whether we're called pedophiles, we're pathologized as sick, we're called a Western imposition, we know the truth about our lives, and we know that the solution is going to be being allowed to tell our own stories our way.
Great. And for those of you with kidney stones, don't eat kale.
I was going to say, Jessica, I'm just going to take credit for the memo that got Secretary Kerry to show up to that event. So
Thank you.
You're welcome. It was a truly momentous occasion, really,
Yeah.
a truly momentous occasion. And it's very important to focus on Secretary Clinton and what she did, but it's equally important to focus on the leadership from the president and from our current Secretary of State in that regard, too.
And I think what you just said emphasizes the importance of having people from the LGBT community in places of leadership, in places where they can make those connections and make these kind of activities happen. Because without you, Secretary Kerry may not have shown up at that event, and the issue wouldn't have been advanced in the way it was. I want to ask a question that I was given in advance from one of our audience members, which is, where is the next big fight for LGBTQ rights? And I think the basis for this question is, we've seen what happened in Uganda, and then we saw Russia, and then you made reference to things happening in Egypt. And it seems like almost every year there's a new international LGBT crisis du jour. And where do you see the next one, or is that really even a fair question? Yeah,
I'll
Steve,
jump in here.
Jump in.
I think we could probably come up with a couple dozen if we wanted to between us. There are so many, but I'll just talk about a couple that we're keeping an eye on or that we're working on right now. And one is Indonesia. And for those of you who may not have heard or followed this, there's been something of a backlash against LGBTI people in Indonesia. Indonesia is the fourth largest country in the world. It's the largest Muslim country, and same-sex relations are not criminalized there, and there's been, I wouldn't say it's been a welcoming place for LGBTI people, but it hasn't been the most hostile either. But that's, the environment in the country has been changing recently due to comments at very high political levels, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Education levels, saying very disparaging things about LGBT people, and that homosexuality should be treated clinically, and that LGBTI people should be banned from public universities, and so things of this nature, creating a really negative environment that's really starting to cause a backlash against the LGBTI community. And the people on the front lines that are feeling that the most, of course, are the human rights defenders that are fighting for rights every day. And so, we started working with the local organization, actually in conjunction with Outright and Human Rights Watch, another one of our partner organizations. We started working with Aris Pelangi, which is an amazing network of LGBTI organizations in Indonesia. And it turns out they were already, of course, on this and starting to respond, and had set up a safe house, temporary safe house for some of those human rights defenders that were having to flee some of the most hostile areas. They've set up a hotline and other emergency support services. And so because Indonesia is such a key country in the region, and there's a potential for a kind of a rollback of rights there to create a domino effect in the region. We thought it was a really important area for us to get involved in. So that's why we set up this campaign that we've been running for about the last month, giving people around the world the opportunity to donate to support the work that Ars Pelangi is doing to help continue funding the Safe House and some of their other emergency support programs. So that's just one. I mean, another one that I'll throw out there, because again, I think we could do examples for days, but Kyrgyzstan is actually has been considering a similar kind of anti-gay propaganda law that would in some ways be even more severe than Russia, and we're seeing this happening in other former Soviet states as well, and that has really been kind of hanging in the balance for a while, and is critical there. Another issue, and again, I don't want to dominate the time, but a huge problem globally is violence against the transgender community. And there's some places, especially in Latin America, in spite of the advances in rights in many countries, including, for example, Brazil, which actually had marriage equality before the United States, but has the highest rate of transgender murders in the world. So another issue that really needs to be addressed critically and urgently.
Czeslaw, you had the experience of really being in a fight to establish Pride in Prague. From your perspective, what could U.S. activists do to help somebody who has a fledgling Pride celebration or is going through a fight for LGBT equality in another part of the world? How could we in the U.S. be helpful in that effort?
Okay, I won't be talking about activists. I'll be actually talking about business, because I believe that this is something that you Americans are great in. And I'm working with Out and Equal right now, and I'm running their global program. And Out and Equal is working with the American multinational companies advancing their LGBT workplace equality. They work mainly in the US, but they are starting to working with those multinational companies that are based outside, to work with them. We work in China, Brazil, but also Italy and other countries. And I truly believe that those multinational companies can make change in a way, because they have global values of diversity and inclusion, and they implement them greatly here. When you come for the Out and Equal Summit, you see 3,000 people, companies are competing, which one is a bigger supporter of the LGBT. Well, the same companies in my country or in China or in Brazil are totally silent. They don't want to talk about LGBT at all. And I think you should ask those companies, why is that? Why you are giving millions of dollars for the conferences in the US, but you are totally silent in other countries. And if they have a global values of diversity and inclusion, they should be truly global, and they should implement them also outside of the US. So I think that this is something that you could do, that you can, and that can support LGBT movement in our countries, because if, let's say, IBM decides to do something in China, then there are money, and those money can actually support the local activists.
And we've actually seen the impact of the business community in some of the fights in the United States, in southern cities and in Indiana, where it was the impact of those companies saying, we're going to take our business elsewhere, that really got some of those places to change their views.
And I believe that the same thing could happen globally. The companies, if they would get together and say to the Tunisian government, stop your draconian criminal law, I think Tunisian government would change their laws, because they are dependent on American aid, but also on American money. And there's many other countries like this.
So Jessica, Steve referenced the work that's being done in Indonesia, and I haven't really given you an opportunity to talk about the work that you're doing there. Tell us a little bit about what Outright is doing in Indonesia, your partner organizations, and where you feel the biggest challenges are for you.
Thanks, John. It's so hard to not answer the question about where is the next crisis. So,
I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
No, I want to talk about Indonesia, but I understand.
I want to hear your answer to that, too.
Okay, I'll just try to answer briefly. I want to say that we could spend a very long time, as Steve has said, on that question, but it's not my favorite question, because I think a fairer way of interpreting the world is to say, what is the next crisis we all become aware of? Not where is the next crisis? And the truth is, the crisis is where you live, where you're unsafe. And the cruel irony of the news cycle is that the reason we learn about certain countries as so-called crisis countries is because either those countries are rich and powerful, and so we have a close bilateral interest in what happens in them, or the activists within that country have decided that globalizing their struggle is a strategy for being safer, or there's any number of factors, like the Olympics are going to that country, and so it's a part of the news cycle in general. I think for me, it's quite interesting to think about crisis in terms of something that's thematic rather than something that's just country-focused. Because the truth is, and I think this was implied in your question, there will always be another country that punctuates the global news cycle. And for me, the thematic crises is, where is the data? Where's the data about our communities? Why are we still citing more than 75 countries have sodomy laws around the world, as though that really tells us how well or how badly we're doing? I think part of the crisis is actually in being counted or not. And we can go on and on about what's a crisis. But it's a perfect segue to Indonesia, John, because another crisis is actually around safety and security for LGBTI communities. So we're in this moment that Wes referred to as sort of like a pendulum swinging. Other people might refer to it as a moment of polarization. So we're sitting here, in the institutional comfort of the city of West Hollywood, council chamber. Not only are we not afraid that the government is going to arrest us for being here, the government is hosting us and welcoming us and validating this conversation. So in Indonesia, Outright has been working with Aris Pelangi and also this mainstream good governance group called Kemitran. And over the past 4 months, we've seen one of the fastest and most severe moral panics spread across Indonesia that I've ever seen in any country anywhere targeting LGBTI people. And because Indonesia is not a country that's regularly a part of the American news cycle, chances are many people don't even know this is happening. And in terms of what are we doing now, I would say actually we're moving into a couple of areas. One is the UN's most influential UN agency in Indonesia is called UNDP, the United Nations Development Program. And they're the most influential agency because they coordinate all of the other agencies in the country. And the government of Indonesia asked UNDP to stop working on LGBTI rights in Indonesia. Literally, the government of Indonesia asked the UN's representative in Indonesia to stop working on LGBTI rights in Indonesia. That keeps me up at night, because if a UN agency isn't safe doing a small sliver of their work for LGBTI rights, then how can the more than 120 LGBTI organizations in Indonesia even begin to feel safe? And so Outright right now is trying to basically bring pressure on every government that will possibly talk to us as an ally to the LGBTI community in Indonesia to say, this is a moment of crisis. And we mobilized in other crises. I keep using Uganda and Russia because those are two countries that people are accustomed to seeing a global response. But we've mobilized in other countries. We need to now mobilize in Indonesia. And I would say this also has a very particular manifestation. In Indonesia, the government has drafted a bill that actually would target LGBTI activists. So people like me and you as threats to state security. Well, I'm not including the government officials because you have a double identity. But so we would be billed as state state threats. And what happens when you're billed as a threat to state security? I mean, the rule book goes out the window, and you are seen as a threat on a scale that goes very far beyond the criminalization of so-called cross-dressing or particular sexual acts. So I think Our Rights Agenda in Indonesia is, let's narrow the definition of threat in that law so that LGBTI activism can continue.
Wes, I'd like to turn to you because you have the experience working in a lot of different countries or with a lot of different countries. Where do you see the role of U.S. activism, U.S. pressure? Do you think that's helpful? Is it hurtful? What's your thought?
I think U.S. action unilaterally in most places is not helpful. There are exceptions to that. I think the Czech Republic is probably a good example where the U.S. by itself could come forward. We're allies of each other. The United States stood by our partners in Eastern Europe as they emerged from communism. It's a different region where the U.S. can do things by itself. But if the U.S. ambassador was to stand up in Jakarta, Indonesia, by himself and speak out without other countries doing so, I think that would be incredibly damaging. In Uganda, doing it by ourselves, very counterproductive as well. And so a lot of what I think about and spend a lot of my time doing is trying to coordinate and grow the chorus of voices that are willing to speak with us. There are many countries that are very unwilling to criticize another country unilaterally in a way that the US is pretty comfortable with doing. But they are willing to stand up if 8 other countries do, if 10 other countries do. And so Jessica referred to the core group at the UN, which is at 18 countries and may grow to 20 later on this month. One of the things that we do, and it's really her fault that we do this more than any other person, is Western countries can't join without bringing a country from another region into the group with them. And so it's really awesome that it's not just the United States and the Netherlands and Norway and France that are standing up at the UN talking about LGBT issues. It's a whole variety of states. And in Geneva, in just 2 weeks, 5 countries are going to place before the UN Human Rights Council a resolution that would really institutionalize LGBTI issues at the UN through the creation of a UN special rapporteur or independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity. Those 5 countries are Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and Uruguay. I did not say the US, I did not say France, I did not say the Netherlands. Now, they would not be doing that if the United States was not there having their back, right? And the same thing with the European Union states and other countries in the West that care about this. I have embassies in almost every country that I can call up to go in and see a government. Brazil is in maybe 40, 50 countries. Most of those other ones are probably in 20 or less themselves. And so they don't have the diplomatic capacity to do this without the United States. But it's exceptionally important that we don't just have the US or the US plus the EU pushing these issues. It feeds into what the president of Uganda was saying when he stood up and talked about the export of homosexuality from the West, which that idea was planted in his mind by American groups, actually, unfortunately, that are out there doing this stuff. But that narrative looks true when the US stands up and does this stuff by itself. But if we can stand up with a diverse set of partners, that's different. And those partners are both countries in the developing world, and it's also international institutions. And so it's been really important to empower the voice of the United Nations itself in this regard. And the Secretary General of the UN comes from a pretty conservative country, from South Korea, which is, in most respects, a very advanced human rights respecting country, but a little bit behind on LGBTI rights compared to even Japan and others. But the Secretary General himself is speaking out. And now we've been able to bring in a new High Commissioner for Human Rights who is a Jordanian prince, right, a Muslim man from the Middle East who was at that event with Secretary Kerry, with all these other foreign ministers, standing right in the middle, holding up a sign that said, LGBTI rights are human rights, in the hands of a Muslim Jordanian prince. we have to empower these kind of voices. We have to, U.S. diplomatic capacity is an important part of that, but it's the important thing isn't that we're doing this by ourselves and that we're speaking out by ourselves, but it's that we've been able to identify an incredibly diverse set of partners that can do this work with us. And it's through that pressure of a group of different kinds of people who look different from each other and come from different places that we're going to be able to succeed. And without that, I think we'll come across as very ham-handed, and we're not going to succeed in building the space that we need.
I'm going to turn to the audience in a minute, but I'm going to ask you one last question before we do. And I've also been asked to ask you to move your mics a little bit closer. I think the people in the auditorium can hear, but we're also broadcasting this. We want to make sure everyone at home can hear as well. We all read the story, and it was fairly well publicized, the death of the editor of a Bangladeshi LGBT magazine, part of one of a series of killings that has occurred in that country. How do you think that type of incident affects the global struggle for LGBT equality? Does it create more of a sense of urgency, or does it create such a sense of fear that people are not willing to come out? And Wes, you're looking at me, so I'll give you the first crack at this.
Sure. Well, actually, that particular activist was also an employee of the United States government. He worked for the U.S. Agency for International Development in Bangladesh, not on LGBT issues, by the way, working on broad development issues in a country that is in desperate need. One of the most overpopulated, densely populated countries in the world, one of the lowest per capita incomes in all of Asia. But this particular incident, Ansar al-Islam, which is the al-Qaeda affiliate in Bangladesh, took credit for this. Just a couple days before that, they had attacked a university professor similarly. And the thing that was interesting that caught my attention there is I actually started working on Bangladesh way back in 2003 at State. These kinds of incidents actually have been happening for a long time there, and it's just these particular two killings recently, which are the ones that for some reason captured the attention of the media cycle. But in a lot of countries around the world, individual activists are under grave threat every single day, and we don't learn the stories of most of them who are losing their life in these fights. I'm pleased to see the attention to this case, but I hope that that attention can not only look at the situation in Bangladesh specifically, or even if just to the LGBT community in Bangladesh, because this is really symbolic of something broader, where we're seeing both vigilante groups, terrorist groups, and governments that are going out after human rights activists, and civil society is under grave threat in a variety of countries, in democracies like Bangladesh and India and Pakistan, in authoritarian countries like Russia, where the space for civil society is shrinking, and when the government says or doesn't say certain things, individuals feel empowered to do things like this. And in Bangladesh, that's the real challenge, is that this happened and the government didn't really respond. It just sort of shrugged that another activist was hacked to death in their country. Similarly, in Russia, after the propaganda law was passed, the government just shrugged as these gruesome videos showed up on YouTube where people were raping supposedly gay men with beer bottles, right, and posting it onto YouTube in Russia, and the government just looked the other way. And I think these are just indicative of something bigger that's happening here, and it's not specific to the case of Bangladesh, but it's something that we really have to open our eyes to, because this kind of thing is happening, I think, in more and more countries right now, and it's something that could spread anywhere.
Czeslaw, you work with people all around the globe. Was this incident something that people have been talking about, that you're working with? Is it creating a greater sense of fear, or is it in some ways energizing people and motivating them to fight more?
Well, I think that it's really country by country cases. I think what was just said was very well put. Those kind of atrocities were happening, are happening, and will happen all the time. What is important is to actually raise awareness about these kind of atrocities and hope that they will incite groups like Alturi to bring attention of UN, Alturi to actually bring attention of all of us to know what's going on and to push the government to bring it to bilateral meetings, because that's what's important. If this death should not be wasted in a way, it's important that we will react to it and we will push the government to catch those who are accountable or who are responsible, and they should be punished.
Jessica, you started, so I'm going to let Steve have the last word. So you want to take this question as well?
Sure, John. Well, I want to say that, the tragic murders in Bangladesh have a very practical implication. One of the things, Outright doesn't explicitly have a project in Bangladesh, but we're reactive when there's a crisis and you need to jump in and do something. And one of the first things that happened was a leading Bangladeshi gay activist reached out to me and said, I have to go into hiding. I need to leave I am in hiding. I need somewhere safe to go. Can Outright provide me with safe refuge for 6 months? I want to come back. I want to work in Bangladesh. This is my people. This is my country. But in order to give back, I need to actually be safe for a period of time. And so the very practical impact, quite frankly, is a real destabilization of the community. I mean, I have read some heartbreaking emails from friends of friends from Bangladesh who are so scared right now. And so on the one hand, I think our obligation is to be there for them. And then on the other hand, it's to understand this act of violence in context. I had some disturbing conversations with, at the macro level, with certain officials, ironically, within the US government, just to be totally nuanced in our conversation, who basically said, look, we're scared in reaction to the murder of an employee in Bangladesh. We want to tone down some of our solidarity because we don't want to expose people to risk. Now, they're not giving the official government position. They're responding as individuals that are trying to navigate really difficult waters as responsibly as they can. And my response to those officials, and this would be my response to any government official, is violence against LGBTI people is not new. Violence against human rights activists is not new. What is new is government support for LGBTI activism. So please, when there's a crisis, double down and be with us. Don't walk away. And I just want to say something incredibly positive about the tragic murder, which is that this actually is a rare moment where there had been killings of other secular writers in Bangladesh, and no one cared and no one noticed. But in this particular instance, 2 gay writers and gay activists were murdered, and it actually exposed a broader human rights crisis. So this is an opportunity, in my opinion, to actually give back, and the LGBTI community should take that opportunity and give back to all the people that deserve it.
As you said earlier, it's global, human rights are human rights, and the LGBT community is oftentimes part of a bigger human rights crisis as it is in Bangladesh. Steve, you've been working with people around the world as well. What have you heard in response to what happened in Bangladesh?
Sure, John. Just to reiterate what everyone has said, this is a crisis that that has been happening, from before the Bangladesh incident, and sadly that is continued even after. And just last week, probably less than a week ago, a prominent gay activist in Honduras was murdered, and the murder is still being investigated. It hasn't yet gotten the attention of what happened in Bangkok, but from what I understand, it was in Bangladesh. But from what I understand, it was a brutal murder. And again, we're not talking about the other side of the world. We're talking about just not too far south of our border. And all these cases highlight both the incredible vulnerability of human rights defenders around the world, and also just the tremendous, almost inexplicable risk that that people put themselves at in order to do this work and to advance LGBT rights. But given all that, and even given this backlash, if you want to call it that, or the pendulum swinging, or the polarization, activists, or something else, the activists that I've spoken to around the world, we've asked the question. Jessica was talking about it in the context of the government. Do we pull back from this work? What do we do? All the activists that I've spoken said, no, we've got to carry on. And in some ways, in some kind of twisted ways, it's a sign that what we're doing is getting noticed, and that in some ways it's a response to the successes or the progress that's being made. And I think that from the activists that we've spoken with, what we can do is we have to continue to do everything possible to keep activists safe. And some activists in places like Nigeria that I've spoken with go to great extremes. They'll have meetings and they check trash cans in the hotel before they leave to make sure there aren't any documents around that would identify them as LGBT. And there's just the level of care. And we obviously treat that. Part of our mandate is to bring attention to global LGBT issues and organizations. But there are times where that would be counterproductive, and there are stories that we run anonymously because we can't identify the activists. So that has to be respected as well. But again, the message that we've always gotten is that the work can and should continue, and that we can't be set back by these things.
Great. John Erickson is back here. He has a mic, and I'm sure some of you have questions for our panelists. So we have a question right here in the front. Come on down, John.
Well, I appreciate all of you presenting to us today, and it's been a wonderful discussion. I did want to add a different perspective a little bit. Maybe I'm the oldest person around here, but just a few years ago, I attended a conference sort of like this, where I think they were from Pakistan, or I don't know if they're Bangladesh, but the Orange County Library had some people there from that country showing the slides of the education that they're doing over there. The problem, quote unquote, is that they were educating women, and the rest of the people in the country had burned down the school. I don't know if they killed the teachers and things, but part of it is what John had alluded to, that it's considered American imperialism. We're over there forcing our values on people, which is contrary to their, quote, religion. And so this is not a human rights thing, but it's a religion against religion issue in many minds along that line. And along that same line, you don't have to go too far internationally to know that Long Beach, California had the Gay Pride Parade interrupted for 2 hours by the same kind of activists that are over there saying, this is not the right thing because my book, my Bible, my religion, or whatever says you're wrong. And so from just a comment back to Czeslaw there, Donald Trump may be our best salvation to not get Ted Cruz in there with the evangelicals, because the Republican platform still has in it marriage is for one man, one woman, and faith-based. And if you don't get religion out of government, we're going to have more of this problem in this country too.
Let's ask the panelists if they want to respond in particular to the issue that you raised regarding religion and this issue of cultural imperialism. Wes, you're looking like you're eager to answer this. But
I would say from within the government, we're keenly aware, of course, of the different arguments that are put forward. The Russians run a resolution at the UN on occasion on, quote, traditional values that asserts that tradition in any country can trump universal human rights. But the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which was drafted by Eleanor Roosevelt, among others, in the 1940s in reaction to the atrocities of World War II, says all human beings are born free and equal in human rights, and it makes very clear that all human rights are embedded in individuals and not groups. And so the human right of a person to love the person who they choose, to be with the person who they choose, and to live their life authentically and openly is truly at the core of what international human rights are defined as. And for us, I think within the government, one thing that's very important for us is to continue to fight on the international stage against countries that want to warp that and change international human rights to be every country can choose which rights are for their people and other ones are not for their people, which goes far beyond the realm of just LGBTI. Women's rights, which you pointed to, is another incredibly poignant example of a group of people whose rights would be under grave threat if that definition were to win out. But we also are keenly aware that it's important to empower religious voices that are positive and LGBTI affirming. And the U.S. State Department has an Office of International Religious Freedom and an ambassador at large for religious freedom, and they've been working to talk to American faith leaders of many different stripes who are willing to go on the public record talking in positive ways about LGBTI rights. And that's going to be important, and it's important to not just get American religious leaders to be the ones saying that, but to be empowering, of course, those affirming religious voices in other countries as well. And it's going to be a lot harder to empower those voices to talk about issues like gay marriage. But I think we can find a lot of people out there from every religious tradition who will say it's not okay to kill someone because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. It's not okay to mistreat someone because of their sexual orientation and gender identity. And even just the change in tone that we see from the current Pope versus the previous one, I think demonstrates that. The Pope isn't going to come out and call for the Catholic Church to recognize gay marriage. But the things he is saying, I think, are sending a real signal to the Catholic community worldwide that is very different than the message that was being said before out of the Vatican. So trying to empower even those incremental change in voice, I think, is going to be very important in the discussion going forward.
I mean, it's the same struggle we've seen in this country, right? People wanting a religious exemption from non-discrimination law. It's that same idea that, okay, we will accept some things, but you've got to give an exemption for us because of our culture, because you're trying to, push your values on ours and interfere with our religion. I think there was a question back here.
Hi, good evening. My name is Mariana Marroquin. I thank you for doing this. I work for the Legal Services Department at the LGBT Center, and I'm also part of the Transgender Advisory Board. So I know a little bit about feeling empowered, but it took so long to get here for me, I love the idea of talking about being empowering people, but something that I noticed about what's happening with the transgender community in Latin America, I see that they're coming here. The service providers are living there. And I noticed that there's so many groups of trans people organized for many years, and they, how can we support these LGBT groups, making sure that the transgender community get those resources? Because I've been talking with someone who has an organization in my country, Guatemala, and we always talk about money, and I'm thinking about but you don't have any staff that is transgender. You don't have a program for transgender people. And that's what hold me to do something about, what can I make sure that the transgender people who are living in Latin America get those resources. At the same time, I noticed that there is a new generation of people in power in different organizations. People that I went to school with, now they have working for organization, helping women's rights and human rights, and they are in power. And I'm sure they will be welcome me to their meetings and to their events because we have history and we know each other, but they're not willing to open those doors for the trans woman over there. So I always think about like, how can we support the transgender community, making sure that, because another side that is super sad is that like the service providers are leaving and they spend time in detention and they get released from detention, but we don't have resources over here. So for me, the idea will be not leaving their country. The idea will be to keep getting education and keep fighting in over there for the community.
Okay, so I think you heard the question. It really is focusing on how many trans women, particularly in Central America, come here for asylum because of the violence that they face, and what can we do to make sure that there are more programs, more support for the activists there. So it affects our immigration policies, but it also is providing the support in the country so that services are there, not just for those people, but for the next generation. And I know you've been doing some work on that, Jess, so tell us what you're doing, and maybe Steve, if you'd like to comment on it as well.
Did you say your name is Mariana? Oh, thank you for your question. I really appreciate it. There's actually a report coming out in the next 2 weeks that maps where funding is going around the world for LGBTI rights. And it's not yet public, but I can share with you some draft numbers. And one of the numbers, it's coming out from Funders for Lesbian and Gay Concerns, and also the Global Philanthropy Project. So 2 different initiatives focused on philanthropy have done this mapping to try to understand, no, but really, how much money does our community have? And the answer in a nutshell is that of private foundation dollars, less than 4 cents on the dollar from private foundations goes to support LGBTI rights around the world. So just grasp that for a second. Less than 4 cents on the dollar goes to support global LGBTI rights. So Mariana's question is very appropriate, especially because Latin America is one of the most under-resourced regions in the entire world. So according to this data, which is based on 2013 and 2014, the US received $218 million in 2013 and 2014 for LGBTI rights work. And all of Latin America and the Caribbean in those same 2 years received approximately $16 million. I want to say that again so that everyone hears that. 16 million. And the US LGBTI movement had 218 million. So I think your question has 2 different core components from my perspective. One is the tragic under-resourcing of trans communities, and the other is the tragic under-resourcing of LGBTI movements in Latin America. And I don't think you asked the question because you know, like, this is a big problem, not that there's an easy solution. But I think that question you just asked needs to be asked in every session in all of these spaces. Like, when are we actually going to invest in the trans community in Latin America? Outright just did a training in Guatemala, and there were a ton of Guatemalan trans activists. It was actually a training on safety and security, because how do you actually organize for your rights if you're afraid for your own safety? And the connected question is, why is it that trans communities that are so often at the front lines of violence so desperately under-resourced? So I'm not sure that I have any particular answer, but I just want to give a little kind of preview. Outright is coming out with 3 reports in the next few months looking at trans legal developments in Colombia, Chile, and Costa Rica. And the good news that I have, especially for people sitting in the US, is actually trans rights recognition, I think, often has more possibility and is moving faster in parts of Latin America than in the US. And so if you want to think about how to inverse the traditional question, how can we as Americans give back to the world, I would say this is one place where Americans can actually learn from another region and be better in our trans rights work.
Steve?
Sure. A great question, Mariana. And I would just add from kind of a practical standpoint, I think what we can do in the near term is find those existing organizations and help get resource and capacity building to them. One organization that's a partner of ours is called Red Lactrans, which is a network of trans organizations in Latin America. And so we've done an initial campaign with them, and we're looking to do another campaign coming up with them. We have another partner organization that has identified a problem in Panama, for example, where the government is targeting transgender women really in stings and arresting them. We think that's an issue that no one's really heard about here in the U.S. that we can bring attention to and hopefully raise some funds to help combat the problem locally and also to stop the government from doing this. So I think it's finding again existing organizations that we can help build the capacity with, and in places where there aren't organizations, help to get those organizations launched.
I will give a little plug for our program. A couple years ago, one of our trans speakers from Venezuela was part of one of these panels, and she was recently elected to the assembly in Venezuela, which I'm not sure I would wish on anyone given the situation they're facing right now, but there is an opportunity for activism and even election.
Yeah.
All right. John, you had somebody in the back, and then we have one up front, and I think John is giving me the signal that we need to wrap up. So,
Good evening. Is there a relationship between government corruption and hostility, whether it's official, unofficial, or personal, to LGBT rights?
No.
I would second what Jessica has to say. If you look at the Transparency International rankings versus where folks fall on the LGBT scale, you would be hard-pressed to find a good correlation there.
So, and that surprises me. I would think that a government that was more corrupt generally would be less supportive of LGBT rights, but that isn't the case?
I would be hard-pressed to find a causative effect.
Okay. So there may be some countries that are very transparent, but also very anti-LGBT rights.
Okay. Could be. That may be less likely, but I'm just trying to think again in the Latin American context, countries.
Closer to the mic.
In the Latin American context, countries that have fairly advanced rights and protections for LGBT people, but that are still very corrupt countries. So, yeah.
Great question. And we have a question up front.
I've learned from a friend of mine who's on the East Coast that Hillary Clinton is LGBT in her private life. And that is a tremendous, if she decides to come out, that'll make a tremendous change in the world.
Well, I think that's a fun note to end. No, I don't want to comment on anyone's sexuality that I haven't slept with, so and even some of the people I've slept with, I'm not sure I want to comment on either. So, but maybe let's turn that into a question about what do you think the role is of out LGBT elected officials in advancing LGBT equality? I certainly have seen it in this country that has played a significant role. Do you think that is the case in other parts of the world as well? And Wes, you're shaking your head, so I'll let you take this one.
Absolutely. Both the election of openly LGBT people themselves is incredibly important for the way that raises profile. But equally important, of course, is the election of people who are affirming and are friends to the community and are outspoken of the community. For Secretary Clinton, I cannot make any comment about what her personal life is. I have no idea. But I know she stood up at the United Nations in Geneva and said gay rights are human rights and human rights are gay rights, just as she had said about women's rights in Beijing when she was First Lady in the 1990s. That kind of political leadership from both out people and also allies of the community is essential. And we're seeing that play out in many, many other countries around the world, not just here in the U.S.
It definitely changes the dialogue.
Yeah, I definitely second that. We in the Czech Republic do not have any openly gay person in high-ranking politicians. We have closeted gay people as a member of parliament, but one thing that I didn't mention, and I would like to mention it, and it's tied with this frontier thing, is that we are preparing the marriage equality campaign. I believe and I'm positive that by 2020, Czech Republic will actually adopt a law that would have that would allow same-sex couple to marry. And as a part of our strategy, we are going to support politicians that are supporting this idea and are openly gay. So we hope that in 2017, when we are going to have elections to the parliament, we will actually, after that, we will actually have openly gay members of parliament that will support our initiative.
That's great. When are you going to run?
Well, I did run already, but I chose bad party. I chose a Green Party, which is unelectable in the Czech Republic. But I was a deputy minister, and I was openly gay in the Czech government 5 years ago.
Great. We do have some time for a little time out in the lobby to have a little reception. We have some food there. Before we wrap up, I do want to thank, don't leave John Erickson. I want to thank John Erickson who organized this program. And I believe Beth Smiths from our Recreation and Special Events staff was outside as well, and all of our friends at City Hall who make these events happen. I want to thank them. I want to thank our panelists especially. Please join me in thanking this wonderful group of people. Thank you. And I want to thank all of you for attending tonight on election night. Before I close, the organizations that are represented tonight, many of them have needs for support. So there is literature in the auditorium in the back, and if you don't get any literature, feel free to ask them for their card. They need our financial support to continue the great work that they're doing. So if you have a few extra dollars, you haven't been hit up by one of the candidates for election too much, feel free to support these organizations. And again, thank you for being here tonight. I look forward to seeing you at other Pride events in the upcoming weeks. Thank you.
Thank you.